Hello, and welcome to the 4th episode of Season 2 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hi, Ray.
Time for another special then, Graham?
Yes, Ray. Do you want to explain?
Of course. Last week we saw the release of a follow-up report from Global Witness, looking in detail at the effectiveness of Companies House here in the UK, which we may have mentioned once or twice.
Yes, and it makes for interesting reading, doesn't it?
It does. And just like in last week's episode, it's important for the global financial crime community to understand these issues, as UK entities are used so extensively by money launderers the world over.
Exactly, and before we begin, and while we're talking about last week's episode, it reminds me of an anecdote that I'd love to share, just to augment our journey through the labyrinth that is UK limited liability partnerships.
Of course.
Well, you'll remember that we used as an example last week an LLP called JSC Moringiologia, partly because that JSC was interesting as it's a common entity prefix found in Central and Eastern European companies.
Where it means joint stock company.
Exactly. Well, one of the other common prefixes is OOO.
And other than out of office, what does that stand for?
That stands for Limited Liability Company, Ray.
No, it doesn't, Graham. That would be LLC.
Well, I know, but it does in Russian.
And are you going to give us the Russian version, Graham?
I did have a look at it, Ray, and it's utterly unpronounceable, so the answer to that is no. Anyway, just for the hell of it, I stuck OOO LLP into Companies House just to see if anything came up.
And did it?
Oh, yes.
Go on.
Well, for a start, there were a whole bunch of Scottish limited partnerships which started OOO, and we may well come back to those in our episode on SLPs. But there were two LLPs which also started OOO.
Really?
Yes. One was called OOO Razukravto LLP, and the other one was OOO CTAPT LLP.
Both rather strange names.
Well, they are, although CTAPT is actually, if you read that in Cyrillic, is start. So if we assume it's Russian, it would be called Start LLC in English.
Anything else interesting about that one?
Well, its accounts were, it only actually filed one set of accounts.
Oh, I've got a funny feeling, Graham, I might know what's coming next.
Which is, Ray?
They were signed by Ali Moulay.
Dead right they were. Any other guesses?
They weren't for very much money?
Total commission for the one and only year they filed accounts was £3,003.
Of course it was, Graham. And what about the other unpronounceable LLP?
The OOO Razukravto LLP. Well, where do I start? Well, it was incorporated in October 2012 with a couple of, well, quite well-known designated members.
Well known. Not Ireland and Overseas and Milltown Corporate Services.
Yes.
But they also formed the JSC LLP we spoke about last week.
Yes, again.
Which means we can be fairly confident about who signed the accounts.
Oh, yes, it was our friend Ali in 2016, and the commission income reported in those were £5,750.
Good grief.
And it's still trading, Ray. They've only just recently filed their 2018 accounts.
Which were not signed by Ali Moulay, if history is anything to go by.
No, they weren't. They were signed by someone called Kemlyn Gentle.
Oh, hold on. Unless there's two Kemlyn Gentles involved in corporate activity on Companies House, isn't that the same person who is a shareholder in Portoro Trade and lived in Grenada?
I believe it is, except the company on whose behalf she signed this time isn't in Grenada, it's in Belize.
Of course it is, and doesn't she get about a bit? Even after all these weeks and all these revelations, I still find it shocking that this network of connectivity exists inside Companies House, apparently undisturbed and undiscovered.
Well, not completely. I mean, we are doing our bit, and nicely segueing actually into today's episode, Global Witness are doing theirs as well.
Global Witness. Before we go on, I think it would be a good idea to explain to our listeners exactly who they are, as there might be some who don't know about the work they do.
I think that's a great idea, Ray.
OK then. So they were founded 25 years ago, back in 1994, specifically to expose and confront corruption and to explain how it can sustain poverty and destroy the environment. They've been active across the world with hugely successful campaigns against, for example, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, corruption in Equatorial Guinea, corporate secrecy of course, and they're currently deeply involved in the Shell Eni case over the allocation of a Nigerian oil field to them through alleged corrupt activity.
Yes, it's achieved some really remarkable results, hasn't it?
It has. It's got offices here in London, in Washington DC and in Brussels, and a whole host of partners and allies around the world.
And I've had the pleasure of working with some of them too, and they're also really nice people.
Great. And they've just published a report into the workings of Companies House.
They have, and it's a mixture of good and worrying.
OK, shall we look at the good bits first?
Yeah, let's. So what struck you?
Well, I guess first of all, the clear benefit that transparency has brought. The register was accessed more than 2 billion times in 2017, and that's an awful lot of accesses.
And I suspect it's gone up even more since then. But Ray, we've spoken before about big numbers and how hard they are to imagine. So should we try and give some context to that 2 billion?
Yeah, that's a good idea. If we assume for the sake of this explanation that the requests were spread evenly over the year, which they probably weren't, but I think we can live with the assumption, the first thing to say is that this equates to just under 5.5 million requests a day.
And therefore that's just under 230,000 requests an hour.
Just under 4,000 requests a minute.
And just to complete this, that's about 65 or thereabouts requests a second.
Yes, and that's assuming even distribution, which it won't be. So there must be times when hundreds or thousands of people are accessing Companies House simultaneously.
Yes, and as one of their more regular users, I'd have to say that the system works very quickly and effectively virtually all the time. So, and very seldom do you have a problem with a request.
Definitely. One of the other areas that really caught my eye in the report was the huge increase in SARS originated by Companies House, who filed 2,264 suspicious activity reports in the year ending April 2018.
Yeah, I spotted that. And to be fair, as a fairly frequent critic of their process, I was both surprised and delighted by that figure.
Yeah. What about you, though, Graham? What did you notice?
Well, Ray, the fact that the public had filed nearly 60,000 reports of likely mistakes in Company House data. I mean, of course, you'd prefer there were none, but the ability of the public to act as another set of eyes on the accuracy of the data is a great way, I think, of holding filers to account.
Very much so. Anything else?
The Companies House has reported a very significant drop in the registration of Scottish Limited Partnerships, SLPs, which is seen as a success story in the fight against financial crime, but I have slight reservations.
Well, why is that?
Well, not to preempt our forthcoming episode on SLPs, I think the way they're being used has changed from being the main vehicle in laundromat activity to being inserted into the ownership chain, often as the PSC of another entity.
Ooh, sneaky.
Yeah, and of course we should not forget that currently you cannot permanently wind up an SLP. So all the hundreds, if not thousands, of currently dissolved partnerships can be frankly revived for the price of a postage stamp and the time it takes to complete a form. And also, I think there has been a resurgence of LLPs as the money launderers have learned how better to circumvent the rules using them.
Which brings us on to the next part of the Global Witness report, the not so good stuff.
Yeah, I was going to ask what your highlights from this part of the report were, but that doesn't seem an entirely appropriate word.
Well, no. There are some really quite astonishing facts disclosed, though. For example, and this again follows on from last week where we disclosed that Twinport Express was a PSC to 22 LLPs, we now find out that there are 6,711 companies that are controlled by a PSC, which itself controls more than 100 entities.
Of course they do. Just wouldn't you love to see their accounts, Ray? I just might have a little sniff around that one, I think.
Yes, but as a counterbalance, nearly 8% of all companies who are included in the PSC regime have declared that they don't have one.
Okay, which could be for the entirely legitimate reason that they have no one who owns or controls more than 25% of the entity. But there's no sense of Companies House actually checking to see if that's true. Just take the declaration on its merits.
And on a similar subject, I see that a total of 0.2% of eligible companies have declared a foreign company as PSC, but which itself is based in a country that doesn't possess a recognised stock exchange, and which means it doesn't meet the actual PSC requirements.
No, and although expressed as a percentage, 0.2% doesn't sound very much, it equates to 8,872 companies, which is, for example, substantially more than all the entities which form the non-resident portfolio at Danske Bank in Estonia.
Yeah, and we know the kind of mayhem that number of entities can actually cause.
Oh, yeah.
Having said that, we're not suggesting that every company that's registered in an appropriate PSC has done so with criminal intent. I'm sure at least some of them are a simple misunderstanding of the rules.
Well, I agree, Ray, but isn't that all the more reason for CH to have some sense checking in place between receiving the filings and accepting them, if only to protect the innocent from inadvertently breaking the rules?
Yep, and catching the not-so-innocent before they can deliberately break them.
Exactly. Possibly my favourite contravention is almost certainly done through either ignorance or just a lack of care when completing the form, and it only involves a small number of entities, but it's still pretty amusing.
Which one's that?
Well, it's the ability to exempt yourself from the PSC requirements because you overtly state that your company is listed on an equivalent stock market. Global Witness have done the analysis and discovered there are 78 such companies.
What, and they're not listed?
Well, 30 of those 78 are private limited companies, which by their very nature can't be listed as it contravenes their status.
That's very true. And the other 48?
Well, to be fair, the remainder are all PLCs, which means they are capable of being listed. Mind you, more than one I looked at were guilty at the very least of sloppy filing, as they are identified as being exempt from disclosing a PSC, as they have shares admitted to trading on a regulated market other than the UK. And when I looked, they were actually quoted on the London Stock Exchange, but like I say, that looks more sloppy than suspicious.
Nevertheless, Global Witness make the point that if it was a requirement to submit your ticker code, which is an internationally recognised way of identifying publicly quoted companies, it would weed out both the dodgy and the dumb at the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree.
And you can't help but notice that Global Witness also identified a raft of filings which included directors under the age of 2 who had the right to receive profits and appoint directors. It's an interesting idea, Graham.
Yeah, and you'd know more than most, Ray, given your aptitude for Excel, just how easy it is to error trap for specific ages and reject anything which falls outside of a predetermined range.
It's simplicity itself, Graham.
Yeah, so Ray, overall, what was your impression of the report?
I think it was probably helpful that BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, had slightly preempted Global Witness by publishing their proposals for reforming Companies House the day before this report was released, and it contains many of the recommendations put forward in the Global Witness report.
It did, although it's only out for consultation at the moment, so it will be a while before all or indeed any of them are actually implemented.
Indeed. So at least we should celebrate in the meantime that by opening up the register we at least have the opportunity to continue to highlight the weaknesses, find and publicise real life examples of where they're being put potentially to nefarious purposes, and maintain the pressure on the government to see through these reforms.
Yeah, I agree. And we'll continue to work with organisations like Global Witness and Transparency International and many others to advocate for change.
Yep, absolutely. We should also have a quick chat about some of the recommendations that were put forward at the end of the report, don't you think? Yeah, good point. That nearly slipped off my radar. They were pretty sensible and I thought straightforward, don't you think? Yes, I mean, ID checks and proof of control look blindingly obvious as necessary requirements. After all, if you need to do that to open a bank account, you should also be required to do so to open a company.
Yeah, I guess the counter argument is that your bank account details aren't put on a transparent register, whereas your company details are.
Well, that's true, but then think about the benefits you get from forming a limited liability company. You might do it to get tax reductions or to be shielded from the full losses your business might make if things go badly. Society, I think, deserves a little disclosure in return for that.
Yeah, it does seem only fair.
And being a lover of databases myself, I also wholeheartedly support the allocation of a unique identifier to anyone listed in the register. That would enable fast and accurate cross-checking of records. Duplication of data is the bane of any database manager's life.
Yeah, an idea, it has to be said, which if rolled out across all public data sets would enable the quick and easy cross-referencing against other important data like shareholders and disqualified directors and other, relevant information.
That would be good.
Yeah. So all in all, we think this report is balanced, informative, and makes an important contribution to the ongoing debate about what we call it the direction of travel for Companies House.
Yes, and that direction of travel isn't all bad, and there's much to applaud, but without a shadow of doubt, it's still too easy for those with criminal intent to circumvent the rules and gain the appearance of respectability that a UK registered entity can bring without properly disclosing the ultimate ownership behind that entity.
But if the UK acts alone in this, there is a risk.
Oh?
Well, why do people who aren't based in the UK and have, frankly, no intention of running these companies in the UK form them here nonetheless?
Well, because it's easy. The UK government has been consistently clear that it wants the UK to be an easy place in which to establish a business.
Absolutely, and it's so easy to do here that the criminals have flocked to set up their companies.
But that's a bad thing, isn't it, Graham?
Well, no argument there, Ray, and in setting up the companies here, where there is a transparent ownership register, they inadvertently give people like us a way to investigate and expose them.
I see what you're saying. If we unilaterally strengthen Companies House controls, then they might shift their business to less transparent regimes.
Yes, that would be good news for us, in a way, but bad news for those trying to detect and prevent global financial crime.
Well, then we'll have to hope that the Companies House reforms, when they come, don't happen in isolation and that there's a worldwide effort to ensure both transparency and proper due diligence over corporate registration.
Yes, Ray, I completely agree. And speaking of proper due diligence over corporate registration, I think we should look at those Scottish limited partnerships in next week's episode.
Well, I suspect there are, in fact I know there are a few people out there who will be eagerly awaiting this episode because we get mail from them.
Do you know, Ray, there are times when I'm not sure if you're being serious or sarcastic, but I actually think you're probably being serious. So nevertheless, we will be looking both at what makes them unique within the range of UK entities available and how and why they became so popular as part of laundromat activity.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dark Money Files. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.